So if we could go ahead. All right, we're recording the presentation and we will be sending it out after the webinar. So please go ahead and drop your name, drop your company, where you're located in the chat. I'd love to know who's here. I see a lot of familiar names, so thank you for joining us. I also see some new names, which is really fabulous. Always great to see new people joining our webinars. So if you have any questions throughout, please drop it in the chat and we'll answer them during the Q&A at the end. And please stay muted through this session. And I think that's pretty much it as far as housekeeping goes. We know from registration that we have property managers, building owners, and consultants, and we're really excited to have you all here. We hope we're able to answer all your questions, and if not, we'll follow up with an email answering any questions we didn't get to. So again, we're recording this. It will be sent out. We'll be sending out the slides afterwards, as well as some critical links to help you prepare as we keep going. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with our agenda. I'll share a quick overview of the Building Energy Performance Standards, or BEPS, as they're affectionately known here in DC. And I'll be joined by Luke Lanciano with the Tower Companies, who'll be talking about a comprehensive building improvements in one of their buildings here in DC. And then it'll be back to me. You're going to be hearing a lot from me today. I'll get into the details on steps to take as we approach the end of this first BEPS compliance cycle. I'm looking ahead to plan for the future. And we'll have a couple of polls. We just started with one. So thanks for filling that out. And then we'll keep going. And we'll also be dropping some links in the chat to help you as we go along. So I am Mary Thomas. I'm the director of the Building Innovation Hub, which is a project of the national nonprofit, the Institute for Market Transformation, whose mission is to drive demand for better, high-performance buildings. And hopefully you all are familiar with us. The Hub helps the building industry in the DC area to create and operate healthier, more energy-efficient, resilient buildings. And we launched 6 years ago with a DOEE grant to support buildings with BEPS and other energy efficiency and high performance building goals in DC. And since then, we've expanded to support the surrounding metropolitan region with similar goals. So here we are at the end of the BEPS cycle in DC, pretty momentous. And we're here to try to help folks navigate how we get across the finish line. So this is the Hub team. It's myself and my colleague Joy, who could not be here with us today. But she'll definitely be on future webinars, and just want to make sure you all know that we are here to support you. And then today, my IMT colleagues Samantha and Diana are here supporting this webinar. So you'll be hearing me refer to them a little bit. So now to get started, we're going to just do a really high-level overview of BEPS and the deadlines. Most of us are already familiar with BEPS, but as a reminder, it's a regulation that sets a minimum threshold for energy performance that existing buildings must meet. And these standards are measured against key metrics such as energy usage and tracked through annual benchmarking data. And there are different models. So here in DC, the BEPS is based on a median approach as illustrated by this graphic, although the standard could be set higher than the median in the future. For this cycle, buildings that are below the median entered the compliance cycle and had to choose a pathway. The two most common pathways are the standard target pathway and the performance pathway. And we'll refer to both of those pretty frequently. And then some buildings are also on the alternative compliance pathway. And the minimum energy performance thresholds change over time under BEPS. And this continuous performance improvement is really meant to drive long-term achievements, reducing building consumption and improving performance across the district. So Diana, if you could drop our BEPS overview in the chat, it might be helpful for people to have that reference. And so it's helpful to think about benchmarking and BEPS together. Benchmarking is the key first step towards the ultimate goal of reducing energy usage and improving performance under BEPS. And buildings above 50,000 square feet have been benchmarking for over a decade. And these are the buildings in this first BEPS cycle. And as of this year, benchmarking now applies to buildings over 10,000 square feet. So the size threshold has dropped over time for benchmarking, and it will for BEPS as well over the next few cycles. So here's where we are in this first cycle. It's the evaluation year. The benchmarking data collected from this year and submitted next May will be used to determine compliance. And the performance deadline is December 31st, 2026. Reporting and third-party verification will follow in 2027, due on May 3rd, 2027. You'll hear that date a lot in this session. And we'll talk about what that reporting submission looks like. I'd like to note that the DC Council, looking ahead to future BEPS cycles, the DC Council recently passed legislation which pushed back the start of future BEPS cycles by 1 year, which means that the current standards reset in 2029, and the next compliance cycle starts for buildings over 25,000 square feet. So as we move on to our next slide, Sam, if you could launch the poll about the current status of your BEPS building. Fabulous. So we'll leave that up for a minute or 30 seconds and we'll keep going. So in order to understand how buildings have been performing with respect to BEPS, we've been looking at these trends with AOBA. The latest data analysis shows highly encouraging process. And this slide shows buildings on the performance pathway. Many of these buildings, if measured using 2024 data, are already achieving their required target. And the green obviously shows this, but even the light red slices are making progress. And then, of course, we want to remember that half of DC's buildings subject to BEPS were already in compliance at the start of the cycle. And this just represents the buildings that needed to take action and shows the performance pathway. So the graphs would look a little different if we included those buildings that were already in compliance. And we see a similarly positive story on the standard target pathway, where the majority of buildings are currently on track to comply. And these buildings need to meet a set Energy Star score or BEPS score for their property type. Now, this just represents the buildings that need to take action and those that chose the standard target pathway. And as we just discussed, remember that half of DC's buildings subject to BEPS were already in compliance at the start of the cycle. So Diana, if you could drop a link to our benchmarking data analysis in the chat, you can check it out on your own. So now I will hand it over to Luke, who will share a great example of a building that has undertaken a range of energy efficiency measures to improve building performance and prepare for future BEPS cycles. So over to you, Luke.
Thanks so much, Mary. I'm glad to be here. My name, again, is Luke Lanciano. I'm the Senior Director of Sustainability at the Tower Companies. We operate a portfolio of buildings in the DC metro area. So, we've been subject to DC BEPS as well as Montgomery County BEPS, and we've gotten very familiar with the programs. Additionally, Tower has, for the last several decades, been really focused on sustainable real estate. And so we've been benchmarking for a number of years. So BEPS didn't present anything new for us in terms of benchmarking, but it did set a pretty decent standard to hit every few years. So I want to talk through one of our buildings, and you can go to the next slide, Mary. This is an office building, 1828 L Street Northwest. It's over 300,000 square feet. Given its size, the potential fines in DC, if this was BEPS non-compliant, were over $3 million. For those with offices, the cycle one target was about 71. And at this building, 1828 L Street, our Energy Star score was definitely compliant at an 80 in 2025. We've been compliant throughout cycle one. So really our focus in this session today is talking through how we're thinking about the future for cycle two, and it might give folks some idea if they're still working on cycle one compliance or trying to plan for the future as well. I have no idea. I have no special information that you all don't have, but my guess is that the cycle two target for office buildings is going to be around an 80 or above. That presents, definitely a challenge for us. If we're at an 80 in 2025, we likely have to improve our energy efficiency just to meet cycle two. And that's not to say anything about cycle three, which itself could ratchet up or have, just a more aggressive standard. Now, 1828 L Street has been in place since the late 1960s. It is an older building, but we have been making improvements to it for, really the decades we've owned it. It just earned LEED Gold recertification. It earned Energy Star Next Gen certification in 2025. We've really focused on making sustainability improvements in this building. So even with those certifications, like you might still need to do more work to meet the BEPS standard in DC or in other neighboring jurisdictions. You can go to the next slide, Mary. Just to talk you through some of what we're seeing over the last few years in the office market. Naturally, COVID impacted a lot of office occupancy. We saw, clients that had been there a long time just not need that office space anymore, so they vacated. We had new clients come in. Certainly, the office market changed a lot, so it's been difficult to find new office clients. But similarly, a problem happened with the retail, with so many offices in the downtown DC area sort of vacating after COVID and the advent of remote work. Retailers faced a lot of challenges, and we have some retail at this building. So we actually had a retailer switch out in the last few years, and that usually doesn't happen except for once every 10 or 15 years, given the long-term leases that retail establishments usually have. Something we noticed in late 2024 with that new retailer is, frankly, it's a lot busier than the old retailer was because it was spending a couple of years in that post-COVID environment, just not really getting very many customers. Similarly, in May of 2024, 2024 was a fun year for us. We had one of our chillers die unexpectedly. This was a chiller that had been in place for only about 12, 13 years or so. For anybody very familiar with HVAC, that is not long enough for a normal chiller. It was not expected, but it did die, and we needed to immediately find a replacement. So, when you need to get a rental chiller, you need to keep the cooling for that building running. That's going to have a pretty big energy impact. So we saw that certainly in our 2025 data. From back in, as you can see from the metric summary below, back in 2020, we were in the high 90s. And then by the end of 2025, we were down to 80 in terms of our Energy Star score. And these are some of the factors that have sort of weighed on the building over the last few years. So we know we needed to do some more improvements to this building. One thing that's been a big help, and actually the IMT folks are a great resource for this, we do green leasing. So whenever a client switches out, an office terminates their lease, new office comes in, they might want to build out that space. We have green leasing terms that sort of set some standards for how you build out that space. And that helps guarantee some level of energy efficiency is thought about during that build out process. So I definitely recommend for any offices out there to consider something like the Green Lease Leaders Program. Even if you don't implement all of it or can't do it for every lease, it is worth considering. And yeah, I think Diana just popped it in the chat for anyone interested. Another big project we did, this was in late 2025, was a update to the garage lighting. So, this large building, over 300,000 square feet, had a very large garage. It was open during normal office business hours, but we had lighting controls that were basically on or off. And so what we ended up doing is swapping out nearly 700 lights for high efficiency LEDs that also had occupancy sensors. So you could tell they could basically tell each of the lights whether there were people around. They would stay on certainly when anybody entered the garage, when anyone was near the parking area, but they did not need to be on overnight. They did not need to be on through most of the weekend, through holidays. And what we were able to see with that project is, even though it's a fairly substantial cost net of the incentives, we also got some really substantial energy savings. We're looking at about a 2.6 year payback with that project. And thus far, as you know, we've seen how it operates, that number does seem to be coming in. So in the next probably year and a half, it'll be fully paid off. And that lighting hopefully should last, another 8, 10-ish years. The other big project, and what I'll spend more of my time talking about, is something called monitoring-based commissioning. Some folks know retro commissioning, or just generally when a new building or a new HVAC system is put in, the commissioning process. Um, but monitoring-based commissioning is when you're consistently doing that type of work, when you are looking at how your HVAC systems operate and ensuring that they are as efficient as possible. This could be checking schedules, checking set points, making sure the parameters are always about right. And we've done this in two main ways. One is we do an internal check with all of our engineers. Um, so every month, I literally review it with the engineers. We look at a series of graphs showing real-time energy use and try to optimize, things like startup, shutdown, any odd overnight use that we're seeing. And then with a third-party vendor, a firm called Insight, we've done a really neat project with them where they got into the mechanics of the building automation system and made suggestions on a range of different efficiency improvements. And I'll be able to show that later on in this presentation. So you can go to the next slide, Mary. So this is kind of like a basic review of what you would see if you were in one of my monthly engineering meetings. This is us looking at two different early August weeks. So you have obviously the 5 weekdays, then you have much lower energy use in the evenings as well as on the weekends. And what you can see is that light blue line is the 2026 energy demand every 15 minutes over the course of that week. So it is notably lower. You can see those yellow highlighted marks are just showing the difference between what the 2026 energy use demand was and what 2025 was showing at that exact same time of year. Weather is always a little bit of a variable, but year over year is a pretty good summation. And you can see pretty clearly that at night, we're typically using less energy. Um, we tend to be starting up a little bit later in the 2026 time period. Mainly, this is due to simply not needing to condition the building as early as we were. And what that is, what all of that yellow effectively represents are uh, energy is energy and energy cost. So I was doing some math on this, and we're saving about $3,000 a week in electrical costs alone when we compare this week in 2026, just a few weeks back, to the same time period in 2025. So even though that yellow is not all over the page, it's just in those specific time periods, the regularity of it and of course, the cost of electricity really adds up fast. So going over this with our teams every month has been really helpful, and we've been able to, catch some problems. But we can't catch all the problems ourselves. Like that oftentimes requires a third party. And Mary, if you want to go to the next slide. This is some of the work that we were doing with Insight, which is sort of a firm that uses a gateway to view our building automation system. They essentially did effectively an ASHRAE Level 2 audit. They scoped out a variety of energy conservation measures or ECMs, and then were able to figure out the annual savings, kilowatt hour savings, cost savings, and be able to advise on some really basically high impact investments. So you can see here in green, they've sort of highlighted the ones that we initially agreed to do. You can see the implementation cost is essentially zero. That is because this is a programming process. Like when you do a retro commissioning, you're basically asking your BAS vendor, the service contractor who is supposed to be optimizing that system and making sure it operates well, to switch one number around, change the scheduling parameters, maybe update a little bit of programming code. And what you can see from the kilowatt hour and therm savings is a pretty substantial change. So on the next slide, you can kind of see a little bit more of the data from this project. Um, so we started this really last year around this time, and we've been able to realize somewhere in the range of 26% kilowatt hour reductions. Now that is hard to sustain for a very long period of time. I don't want to say it'll always be 26%. Things like this vary, but we've been seeing really quick payback with this type of project. You know, not even a year of simple payback, just a couple months. And that operational savings of around 90-ish thousand dollars a year was sort of combined with some rebates that equaled, more than that. So yeah, about $128,000 check we were able to receive through DCSCU as part of this project. And what this firm did is, they used the custom rebate process through DCSEU, which I definitely recommend for anyone in the DC market. Um, Reach out to DCSEU, talk with one of their engineering team members, get some ideas. Like they're very, very smart folks over there, and they can potentially give you some good ideas for energy savings measures that are cost effective, that can result in some positive rebates and get your building in a better energy situation. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Mary. And of course, if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or I'll be here for the Q&A at the end.
All right, thank you, Luke. Lots of really great lessons to learn about that project, 1828 L Street. I think it's a really great example of some, physical like garage lighting changes, but then also monitoring your controls and commissioning. Really runs the range of the different types of things that folks can do at their buildings in order to see real savings. And we'll touch a little bit more on DCSEU's incentives later this session. And I think there are a couple of DCSEU people on this call. So, well, lots of good overlap there. So we're going to pivot a little bit and go through key steps to take our buildings across the BEPS finish line. And so the rest of our session here, we're going to talk about the steps and what we're calling kind of an end of cycle guide for building owners and managers to check on where your building stands, to act on remaining opportunities to reduce energy, and to prepare for reporting and building your BEPS story. So as well as getting help and understanding your options and planning ahead for future cycles. This is not necessarily a comprehensive one-size-fits-all plan, but hopefully, useful guidance that everyone can take advantage of. So just, as a reminder, buildings that are not in compliance with BEPS at the end of this cycle will be subject to enforcement and financial penalties, which are now called alternative compliance payments. So now is really the time to make sure your buildings are on track. And so we'll walk through these steps with you. We're also publishing a companion blog, and we'll be sending it out following this webinar so you have it for reference. And I also want to note that DOEE issued updated BEPS guidebook last week. I think a lot of folks here may know about that. So I just wanted to note that we'll be touching on some of these updates today, but next month we're going to be taking a deeper dive in another webinar. DOEE is going to have their own webinars and sessions around this. So I just wanted to note that because we'll be referring to it, but this is not the deep dive into the guidebook updates. We'll be covering a lot of other things that folks need to know about. So moving on to our first step, I really want to start with a quick BEPS checkup. And if you're not sure where your building stands, don't wait until the end of the year to find out. You can do all this right now. So, just some housekeeping first, right? Make sure your contact information for your property in Energy Star Portfolio Manager is up to date. And definitely make sure it includes an email address associated with the building owner. A lot of portfolio manager accounts are through the benchmarking provider, but you really need to have an email address with the building owner associated with it because DOEE sends all their building specific information to the contacts reported through your portfolio manager account. So this includes questions, comments, and even enforcement notices. So you don't want to miss those. And DOEE has help desk instructions on how to update your contact information, which Diana just dropped in the chat here. And if you're a building owner and you haven't already set up an account in the Beam Building Owners Portal, make sure to set one up as soon as possible. I think most people have, but for those who have not, having an account will help you understand and track your status. And again, Diana just dropped a link in the chat to that. So the next two items, we're going to take a deeper dive to explore. So, of course, checking your latest available benchmarking data to see how far you are from the target. And then once you've checked your data, you can evaluate whether it makes sense to change your pathway selection. So check your data, check your pathway. We're going to talk next on how checking your data and confirming your compliance pathway really go hand in hand and what that might look like. But first, we're going to do a poll, or if Sam could launch the poll on what BEPS pathway you're on. We'll leave it up for a little bit while I continue. So when you're checking your data and confirming your compliance pathway, a few key things to consider is that for buildings on the standard target pathway, make sure to check your Energy Star score and ask yourself, how close are you to the standard for your property type? And then if you're a building that's ineligible for Energy Star score, check your source EY. And also noting, in these guidebook updates, DOEE has a whole section on how they're using a BEPS score, which we're not going to go into here in detail, just noting that it's really, for most buildings, it's the same as the Energy Star score for the majority of your buildings. But another reason to get a building owner's portal account, because then you can see what your BEPS score is. So that's buildings on the standard target pathway. For buildings on the performance pathway, make sure you check your progress using adjusted site UI, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And if you're not close to your target, a key consideration is how much might your alternative compliance payment be? So you want to calculate that payment that DOEE might assess using the formulas outlined in the BEPS guidebook for each pathway as noted here. And at this time, just make sure to look at the full guidebook PDF for that information, as the help desk summaries are still being updated. And once they're updated, it'll be easier to find on their website, but the PDF of the guidebook has all that information in these chapters referenced. So I mentioned buildings on the performance pathway need to check adjusted site UI. And the reason for that is the metric used for these buildings. I think most people are familiar with weather normalized site UI or just site UI, and I've been looking at that one, check your data. But really, to get an accurate view of how your building will be evaluated, you need to look at your adjusted site UI, which in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, it's called Site UI Adjusted to Current Year. And why is this used? It's because it allows for a more accurate comparison between the baseline year and the current year, because it also accounts for building operating conditions, such as hours and occupancy, to reflect current conditions, as well as weather normalization. So it allows for a more of an apples to apples comparison between your baseline year and your evaluation year. And the hub has a blog, which Diana just dropped in the chat. We created this in collaboration with AOBA to explain further what the adjusted site UI metric means and how to check for it. And once you've checked your data and your performance, if you've found that it makes sense to change your pathways, you have until the end of this year, December 31st, 2026, to submit an application through the Beam portal. You'll need to provide an explanation for why you're seeking this change. And, an example that we've actually seen is that, some folks who've selected the performance pathway, but find that their Energy Star score is close to or even above the standard for their building type, even though they haven't reduced the full adjusted site UI by 20%, it makes sense for those buildings to switch to the standard target pathway. And you have until this year to apply for that change. So even if you haven't met the standard, your payment may be less than if you had stayed on the building performance pathway in this example. So our first step was to do a BEPS checkup to know where you stand. And then we also encourage everyone to continue making improvements during the remainder of this compliance period. I think we can close the poll if it's not closed already, just noting that. So as we noted, this is the evaluation year. Your energy performance during 2026 is how DOEE will determine whether or not your building is in compliance and what payment to assess if it is not. So make sure to look at your existing systems and operations and complete the make sure to look at your existing systems and operation and complete your remaining projects and maintain improvements already made. And make sure to monitor your energy performance to catch any issues early. This helps not only with compliance, but also ongoing energy savings that can reduce your utility bill. And I see in the chat there was a request to restate the adjusted site UI definition. So I will just go back briefly and we can also talk more about that in the Q&A if there are questions. But definitely check out the blog that Diana linked in the chat. Feel free to take a screenshot here. This is just, for a lot of buildings, it really won't make much of a difference. But if your occupancy has changed a lot, then, it might make a difference. So want to make sure you're checking the most accurate data. So moving back, the next step is to start. So after we talked about step 2, our next step is to start documenting progress and efforts and get ready for the reporting that will be due next year. You want to start building your BEPS story. And what did you do? What actions did you take? And what does that data look like? All buildings that entered the compliance cycle will need to submit a completed actions report with benchmarking data that is third-party verified by May 3rd, 2027. So you want to start getting ready now, and we'll go through each of these actions in more detail to help you prepare. And just to answer the other question back about the adjusted site UI, Kim, if you look at the blog, it'll have screenshots and instructions on how to find that feature in Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So, all right, shifting gears back to the completed actions report. Building owners will need to submit this report via the building owner portal. And this report demonstrates how building owners have achieved their BEPS goals. So make sure to download, fill out, and submit the energy efficiency measures reporting spreadsheet from the completed actions report ticket as well. DOE has specific instructions on how to submit this report through the building owners portal, and you will need to have an account as we discussed earlier. And you must file this report regardless of whether your building meets its final energy performance requirements. So taking a closer look at what's required for this completed actions report, it consists of both an online form or ticket, and then also the EEM reporting spreadsheet that we mentioned just now. And some information is required, as noted here, including a survey of energy efficiency measures, which are filled out in the spreadsheet. Optional information as part of this report will include incentive types and amounts and building specific challenges that you may have encountered. And I'll just note that, this list it may be subject to change depending on how DOEE makes any updates to their forms. So make sure you're looking at the latest available information on DOEE's website. And DOEE will use this information to approve the program moving forward. So along with the completed actions report, you will need to submit third-party verified benchmarking data also on May 3rd, 2027. Accurate benchmarking data is always important to optimize your building operations, but this year the stakes are higher, of course, because of BEPS compliance. And we may recall we all did our third-party verification back in 2024 of 2023 data. Looking ahead, data verification would be required every 6 years to align with BEPS cycles. So don't wait until the last minute. Start pulling together your documentation and hire a third-party verifier now. And make sure to hire someone who meets the credentials required by DOEE. So we're going to launch another poll to see where folks are with the third-party verification process. Might be pretty early in the process, but good to get started now. And the hub has resources to help. These were initially created with Stephen Winter Associates for the 2024 third-party verification deadline. We've made some updates to reflect where we are currently. And these resources include a downloadable scope of work that you can use to hire a third-party verifier and a companion guide to help navigate the process. And DOEE also has helpful guidance on the help desk site. And we'll send out these links along with others following the webinar. And we'll drop in our guide at this time, which I see Diana has already done. So thank you, Diana. And then we also, we noted that verifiers need to have specific credentials. And this is not really a service that's easy to Google, but you can find a verifier through the Hub's vendor matchmaking portal. We are in the process of transitioning to a new platform called Momentum, which will be more streamlined and user-friendly. But in the meantime, you can access the program through our existing webpage. So please don't hesitate to use that. And Diana will drop a link in the chat to our vendor matchmaking portal. Okay, so we've gone through steps that everyone should take. And I think we can close the third-party verifier poll at this time. So we've gone through steps that everyone should take. And you want to be checking your contact information, checking your data, checking your pathway, continuing to take action, and preparing your documentation for reporting and starting to build your BEPS compliance story. And pretty much everyone needs to do that in order to comply with BEPS. But there are some buildings that may need additional help, whether it's technical assistance, more time, or other relief options. And of course, remember that changing your pathway, which we discussed on step 1, is also an option if you're struggling to meet the target on your current pathway. So it's important to understand what your settlement options are if you are concerned that you may not comply, despite making a good faith effort. But I will note we are not yet at the end of the compliance cycle, so we don't know that people are not in compliance or not. We just have a good idea based on where the data stands. So just trying to help folks prepare for all different scenarios here. So we'll touch on each of these topics at a high level. And I mentioned at a future webinar in September, we'll take a deeper dive on relevant changes made to the guidebook updates. So starting with technical assistance, the Hub offers one-on-one consultation to educate owners on key BEPS milestones and recommended next steps towards compliance, including connections with further technical and financial assistance through partner organizations like DCSU, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then we also keep you all informed through our newsletter, LinkedIn, and events like this. So I think Diana's going to be dropping a link to the newsletter and LinkedIn in the chat if you'd like to connect and stay informed. And so you've heard about DCSU. Luke mentioned their custom incentive program. They have a number of programs. They provide technical assistance and financial incentives to move forward with energy efficiency projects. And you may even be eligible for rebates for efficiency measures installed in this past fiscal year. So they have a number of projects to fit your needs and property type, including business rebates, custom incentives, and income qualified programs, such as the Affordable Housing Retrofit Accelerator. So there's a link to DCSU in the chat here. And that covers, the technical and financial assistance that may be needed. There's, of course, more out there and lots of, service providers out there that can help with this as well. But, we also want to focus on what's built into the BEPS system. So you may have the option to apply for a delay of compliance if meeting the energy performance requirement is practically infeasible by the end of this cycle. And we also want to note that delays are subject to DOEE approval, and the deadline for applying for a delay is April 1st, 2027. So to be eligible for a delay of compliance, You must meet certain criteria, such as change of ownership, if it creates an unavoidable circumstance preventing the new building owners from making an improvement. And there are other options that are outlined in the BEPS guidebook under the section noted here on the slide. So buildings experiencing financial distress can request a delay or exemption, which we'll touch on next. But first, Diana, if you could drop just a link to the guidebook in the chat. This will take you to the PDF, and eventually DOE will be building out the specific chapters so you can read them online. So we've talked about some of these guidebook updates, and one of the things that was introduced is that buildings experiencing documented financial hardship are now eligible to apply for a whole cycle exemption if required improvements could not be implemented due to financial constraints. And the deadline, but you can also still apply for a delay with financial distress. The deadline to apply for a delay or exemption is also April 1st, 2027. And DOE is setting up forms and templates to help with this application process. You can start applying now. And if your building is not on track for compliance and you anticipate that DOE will assess a payment, it's good to learn about your settlement options and start collecting relevant documentation. An option that was introduced in this new guidebook update is the building improvement agreement. It's an option that would allow building owners to reinvest back into their buildings under certain parameters with financial compensation for the delay. DOEE is also considering good faith efforts, which are recommended by the BEPS task force. So for instance, if a building owner has completed everything on an energy audit, but still didn't meet the target, what does that mean for your building and the payment that may be assessed? And guidance on the good faith efforts is coming out this fall. But you can also take a look at the BEPS task force meeting minutes from April. You can find the BEPS task force on the help desk website. And if you want to get a sneak peek at what was considered, what's under consideration for these good faith efforts. So, the bottom line here is to continue making efforts to try to hit the target in the meantime and start collecting your story now about what you've done and what you've tried to do to comply. Okay, so we're on our last step here, and we are going to launch our last poll. So as we look beyond the cycle 1 finish line, we want to know what's your primary focus for your building asset. So we'll leave this up for a minute, and then I'll keep going in the meantime. So we've talked about getting to the finish line with the cycle. And we also want to look ahead to the next cycle, which applies to all buildings over 25,000 square feet. Buildings that did not have to take action in the last cycle may have to take action in the next one. So Luke gave a great example of 1828 L Street, where they're trying to future-proof for these future cycles with measures that they're taking advantage of now. The standards will reset on January 1st, 2029. DOEE has indicated that those standards will likely be based on 2027 benchmarking data. So, just a reminder that this is a continuous ongoing process. It's not one and done. So we want to make sure that you're ready for the future as well. We recommend maintaining performance, completing cycle 1, and completing all your cycle 1 reporting, of course, and then looking for additional savings ahead of the next cycle. Aligning your energy upgrades with capital plans and tenant turnover, and even considering electrification and a level 2 energy audit. So make sure your team is prepared, make sure your benchmarking data is ready, and get ready for the next cycle. And part of that also is a consideration of the introduction of a trajectory pathway, which may be an option. It was included in the BEPS Amendment Act of 2024, and the task force is currently going through recommendations to introduce a trajectory pathway, which would allow for greater long-term certainty for building owners. So that'll be something that we'll be sharing more information about as it's available. Okay, so I think we can close the poll. So in closing, just before we get to the Q&A, a few things to consider and other resources to look out for. we've talked a lot about what BEPS requires and how to get to the finish line, but it's also really important to understand why these standards matter because it's not just a regulatory requirement for the sake of regulations. BEPS create an opportunity to improve our buildings where we spend most of our time. We spend 90% of our time indoors. Better performing buildings can reduce operating costs and support healthier indoor environments, improve affordability, and strengthen resilience. And especially in these times when we're seeing such high energy prices and more extreme weather, efficient and resilient buildings can provide greater stability, lower costs, and provide greater certainty for owners, operators, and occupants. So with that, I just want to highlight we've got a couple of resources and webinars coming out. I mentioned that we're going to be posting a companion blog to this webinar. And then we also are posting a separate blog with a closer look at those guidebook updates that we talked about and what they mean, how they may be applicable. And then looking ahead to September, we have 2 webinars coming up. We've got the DCSEU Roundtable on reducing energy costs with smart building controls. It's tentatively September 10th at 11, but we'll be confirming that. So keep an eye out for an invitation for that webinar. And then also in September, we'll have a deeper dive into the BEPS guidebook updates. So with that, we're going to shift over to Q&A. And I just really want to thank everyone for coming and for listening and learning. And now I know that I'm going to scroll back through the questions here in the chat. We also had some questions with our registration that Diana, if we don't have anything in the chat, maybe we could go through those questions.
Mary, we do have a question in the Q&A window. So we have, do energy savings achieved above the 20% reduction requirement during BEPS cycle 1 count toward compliance in the second BEPS cycle? In other words, will we get credit for the additional 5% if we reduce by 25%?
So DOEE with the, I mentioned that there are alternative compliance pathways, and one of the alternative compliance pathways is accelerated savings recognition. And so with these guidebook updates, DOEE has introduced what's called a level 0. So for buildings that have accelerated, reached beyond a 20%, that can, you can enter into the accelerated savings recognition and it could apply towards your next cycle. And I think if you're on level 0 by the end of the next cycle, so instead of, being if you're on the performance pathway, getting on the performance pathway again, where it's 20% reduction, it would be a 36% reduction compared to your 2019 baseline. So it's a little bit confusing, and I can definitely make sure to point out where the ASR is described in the guidebook, because that has some good, graphics and information on how to understand that. But they are trying to take into account, buildings that may be above 20% in this cycle, what that means for the next cycle.
We also have a question from Dominique. So Dominique, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
I just wanted to know what else can we do to cut energy costs besides as far as the startup schedule and like trying to monitor like the efficient of like the AC units and everything like that. So what else can we do to build to bring the energy costs down to the building?
Luke, is that something you want to be able to speak to from your experience?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot. It depends on the exact building type that you have, like the HVAC systems you have. Like some of the biggest things when it comes to, if you're scheduling, oftentimes, like in some of our buildings, we'll have a chiller system. There'll be chilled water circulating in the building. Then there'll be air handlers that push that water or that push air throughout floors. So at startup, you can stage those systems so that you might start circulating some water and then push out like cooler air later on in the morning. When I say later on, I mean like 6:30 instead of 5 a.m. Um, Sometimes that can help reduce your demand for that period. Naturally, like one of the biggest things is the fan motors and pumps that you have in your building. I would just generally recommend if you have any sort of motor, pump, fan that is above 15 horsepower. See if you can put a variable frequency drive on it and modulate how much, like the level of hertz that is going to that motor, because that is one very, very easy mechanical way to reduce energy use. For example, like you might just have a pump that is too large for like 80% of the time that you're operating your building. It runs at 100% if you don't have a variable frequency drive, but you can drop it down to like 50% of the electrical use very quickly and easily with a variable frequency drive. Um, Talk with a mechanical engineer certainly before you do that, but it's a something that towers used a lot because if you can modulate the hertz that is literally going to that motor, the savings is really dramatic. That's one of the biggest things that helped us with our commissioning project. And you can get like DCSEU will offer you just a prescriptive rebate for variable frequency drives. So they will just immediately like cut you a check if you've talked with them, got it pre-approved. And if it's a sizable motor, sizable pump, it can have really dramatic savings because it's just sort of consistently modulating below 100% rather than that 100% all of the time. Oh, a VFD is for essentially motors that can support different hertz. So pumps and fans are often like the biggest use cases for them. So if you have a like chilled water pump is like a really good condenser water pump. Those are often very sizable for large buildings. But yeah, air handler fans also often work. Um, and of course, talk with a mechanical engineer. This is not building medical advice, but yeah, they have been a dramatic help for many of our buildings. And yeah, it's a very cost-effective intervention.
All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Diana, what's next?
Mike has a follow-up question about what the availability of grants for VFDs for condos.
That
I
would
would
be,
check DCSEU
yeah.
to see if so like they offer prescriptive rebates, which means like depending on the size of the VFD, and like the size of the VFD is based on the size of the motor, they'll just offer you like a certain number of dollars, and it's a check. So once you've actually installed the VFD, you send them the invoice after it's already been pre-approved, and they will send you a check. And yeah, we've utilized those before, and I don't know exactly the condo situation, but I would talk with DCSEU.
All right, thank you.
We also have a couple of questions from registration. How would DOE calculate fines if you don't meet BEPS?
Yeah, so we did touch on that. Let me see. Might have to go back pretty far, but when we were talking about checking your pathway, are you on the right pathway? Part of the context there was calculating your potential fines. And so in the guidebook, DOEE has information on your alternative compliance payments under chapter 7.1. It used to be chapter 6.1, now it's chapter 7.1. It's pretty straightforward for performance pathway, right? Because if you're, let's say, I'm going to not very good at this mental math thing, but if you have, a 100,000 square foot building and you might be looking at $1 million fine for maximum penalty if you're on the performance pathway, and let's say you did not achieve 20%. So you'd be looking at $1 million fine. But let's say you actually achieve 10% of that, so you reduce your energy by 10%, your fine would be cut in half. So instead of $1 million penalty, it would be a $500,000 penalty, $500,000 penalty. So that's a starting place, and they explain that in the guidebook. It's a little more nuanced for standard target pathway because it's based on your Energy Star score. And so it's, not as simple as just looking at percentages like that. But it's a similar concept where if you make your way a certain, you get part way towards your target, your maximum penalty would be reduced. And so the formula for that is in an appendix, Appendix E of the standard target pathway, which is formerly Appendix D. So hopefully that is helpful.
We also have another question. What's the best way to find out the status of my building and how it's making progress towards my BEPS goal?
Yeah, so getting a building owner's portal account, or if you already have one, checking it, because that'll reflect the information that it'll tell you what DOEE sees as your BEPS score. It'll tell you what DOEE sees as your adjusted site UI data, and it'll be what you see there is based on your most recent data submitted. So 2025 data was submitted this past May, but it won't be exactly, because we don't know yet what your 2026 data looks like, but it'll be a good approximation of where you think you might end up. So I think with that, we're at 129. I just want to thank everyone for joining this session. Please don't hesitate to reach out with questions. We've dropped our newsletter, we've dropped our LinkedIn, a lot of ways to reach us, but also I'm going to drop in my email address so you can reach out to me directly if you have questions. We have a couple of other, resources and webinars coming up to really help folks at this time. And then and we'll also be sending out a follow-up email with a lot of these links, with a lot of these resources that are out there to help you navigate the end of the compliance cycle. And I really want to thank Luke for joining us. Really great to hear about your project and your expertise. And so thank you. Thank you very much, Luke. And yeah, with that, I think we can end our webinar. So thanks, everyone.